In the theory of evolution, I see you're very interested in that. Just perked up when you heard theory of evolution. In the theory of evolution, Darwin discovered very interesting similarities in the different levels of life, different phases of life, stages of life, from the most simple to the most complex. Of course, in the sensationalist writings on science, they immediately turned that into this notion that human beings are descendants of lower forms of life. But the basic reason for it is because they see a progression. And the progression suggests ancestry. Of course, we know that the ancestry part is not true, not even scientifically. But what do we make of these interesting similarities between the lower forms of life and the higher forms of life? The Torah says that there are certain animals, certain meat that you may eat, and there are certain animals or meat which you may not eat. But in the Hebrew, eat and not eat can also be understood in the sense of eaten or not eaten, which means you can eat something, but it is not really eaten. So there are certain animals which, if you eat them, they don't get eaten. And that's what it means that you can't eat. And then there are those animals when if you eat them, they are eaten. The reason we eat in the first place is because God created a world not so much for what it is, but for what it can become. We say in the Kiddush, Asher bara elikim la'aseis, which God created to do, which doesn't make any sense. So the commentaries say, God created the world, la'aseis, to make something of it. He created it for us to make something of it. In other words, it is not a finished product. It doesn't exist as it is for itself. It exists for a purpose, and a purpose means that it has yet to become what God wants it to be. So when God finishes creation and he sees all that he had done, and it is very good, it's very good as raw material, but it's got a long way to go before it becomes what God wants it to be. So the world was created to progress, to rise, to become something more. In the world, God created 4 kingdoms. The entire universe is made up of 4 kingdoms: the inorganic, the vegetable, the animal, and the human. That's it. That's all of creation. We are given the commandments in order that we, by our own freedom of choice, elevate the world and bring it to its fulfillment. That's why we eat. When we eat, we absorb into ourselves the food that we are eating, and the vegetable that was once a vegetable, absorbed into the human body, now becomes human. The inorganic, the water or the salt, absorbed into the human body, is no longer mineral, it now has become human. And the animal, absorbed into the human being, is no longer animal, it is now human. This is the upward process by which the world is elevated towards godliness. When a person eats meat, he's actually elevating all 3 kingdoms, the mineral, the vegetable, and the animal, because the animal lives off the vegetable. Kosher animals do. Some other animals live off animals, but then we're not allowed to eat them. The animals that live off vegetables, the vegetables in turn live off minerals, earth and water, so that when we eat the animal, we're actually elevating the mineral within the animal, the vegetable within the animal, and the animal within the animal. and we raise them all up to the level of the human. Now, in the human being as well, we are composed of all four kingdoms. There is the mineral within the human being, there is the vegetable within the human being, the animal, and then there is the human of the human, that which is uniquely human. The mineral and the vegetable and the animal, they all have things in common. There's more commonalities between them than there is between the human and the animal. So the vegetable, the animal, and the mineral belong to a category. They're all of the same cloth, whereas the human is not of the same cloth. What is the primary difference between the human and everything else? Everything else rises to its fulfillment through something else. The mineral is elevated through the vegetable. The vegetable is elevated through the animal. And the animal is elevated through the human. What elevates the human? He does it himself. He fulfills his purpose within himself. It's self-fulfilling. That's very different, qualitatively different from the other three. What is it that the human being elevates himself towards? What is he supposed to become, be absorbed into? He has to be absorbed into godliness, into God's will. Because the human being elevates himself, fulfills his own destiny, so to speak, whereas the mineral, the vegetable, and the animal depend on others or on something else to fulfill their destiny. That's why the fulfillment of the destiny comes in different ways for the human and for the others. The others fulfill their destiny by losing their identity. As long as the mineral is a mineral, it can't be elevated. It has to be consumed by the vegetable. And in the vegetable, it loses all of its properties, all of its characteristics. It becomes vegetable. And you can no longer identify it or recognize it as a mineral. The same is true when the vegetable is absorbed into the animal. It's no longer vegetable. It's not identifiable as a vegetable. It has become absorbed to the degree where it has been consumed and has basically lost its identity as a vegetable. And the same is true with the animal. So how are the other three kingdoms elevated? In a sense, their destruction is their fulfillment. When they stop being what they are in favor of something better, that's how they become fulfilled. This is not the case with the human being. When the human being is elevated into godliness, he doesn't stop being human. He becomes a godly human being. And that's because he is fulfilling his purpose by his own volition. He doesn't have to surrender his existence to something else. He is capable of fulfilling his purpose as he is. And so he doesn't have to be consumed by something bigger than himself. He devotes himself to something bigger and thereby elevates himself. Which is another virtue to the gift of freedom of choice, which the other three don't have. The gift being that if you elevate yourself by your own will, then you don't have to be destroyed to be elevated. You don't have to be consumed. And I guess that's what part of the lesson. Aaron's two sons went into the Mishkan and they were consumed by the holiness. And that's when God said, don't do that. That's not what I mean by elevate yourself. That's good for animals and for plants and for minerals, but not for human beings. Now, in elevating the things that we eat, and eating, by the way, is a metaphor for any kind of pleasure taken or enjoyment derived from any physical substances. Eating is just the most obvious. When we eat, we elevate the other three kingdoms by absorbing them into ourselves. But it's not enough. And people talk about the food chain. Even without holiness, even without godliness, just because of the nature of the food chain, when you eat, you elevate. Because what happens is this. The vegetable that you eat, that you absorb, merges with the vegetable within you, since we're made up of all four kingdoms. The mineral you eat becomes part of your mineral, the vegetable you eat becomes part of your vegetable, and the animal you eat becomes part of the animal within you. So that's elevated. I don't know, in homeopathic writings, some of the symptoms of different illnesses is called a vegetable problem. The vegetative process in the human being is somehow not healthy. What does vegetative process mean? Simple physical growth. That is the vegetable within us. There's a process where we behave like a vegetable. For example, failure to thrive. Failure to thrive is like a plant that isn't getting enough sunshine. It's exactly the same process. So failure to thrive in a human body is basically a failure of the vegetable function of the human being. Your vegetable part is not functioning right. You need to be watered more. The animals that we don't eat, what about those? But by the same token, we can't eat all the cows in the world. So what about those cows we don't eat? We elevate the kingdom, not every piece of the kingdom. So when you elevate a cow or two, the whole tribe is elevated. So everything is always moving upwards. Unfortunately, there's also, which is not really relevant to tonight's conversation, there's also the reverse process. The ocean kind of eats away at the beach, and the vegetable kind of rots into the earth, and the animal dies and decomposes and becomes part of the earth. So there's a return process as well, but that's called death. So by the very act of eating, even without godliness or holiness, just the fact that it's moving up the food chain, that already is an elevation. So if I eat vegetables and it becomes part of my vegetable, it's an elevation because the vegetable within the human is higher than just a simple vegetable. And if I absorb minerals into the mineral within me, the part that doesn't grow, that's an elevation for the mineral because now it's mineral within the human. It's a step up. But that's not what we mean by true elevation. True elevation means that when you eat meat, which contains all three kingdoms, you absorb that meat not into the animal of you, but into the human of you. So you're not making the animal into a better animal, the vegetable into a better vegetable, and the mineral into a better mineral. You're turning all of them into the human within the human. Now the Torah says, in order for you to eat meat, there are two conditions, there are two signs, there are two indicators that tell you whether you can eat it or not. The two indicators are chewing its cud and having split hooves. What is the significance of these two indicators? Why are they necessary in order for the food to be kosher? It's because, as the Torah says, if the animal has these two signs, then you may eat it, which means you can absorb it. You can elevate it. If it doesn't have these two signs, then it's not eaten. That means that even if you chew on it, it won't be eaten. It won't be elevated. It will stay on the same level that it was. It was vegetable, it'll stay vegetable. within you. If it was mineral, it'll stay mineral within you. And if it was animal, it'll stay animal within you. Now, what happens when I elevate the meat, which is animal, to the animal within me? For the meat, that's an elevation, because animal just became human. But for me, it's a descent. I'm going down. I am increasing the animal within me, which means that I'm less human. So how can I be elevating the animal? How can I be raising it upwards when I'm going downwards? You can elevate the animal with you. As you go up, you can elevate stuff with you. But if you're going down, how are you elevating anything? So if a person eats meat, and the meat is absorbed into the meat within the human being, that's down. And that's why elevation means not to elevate the meat to the level of human meat. You have to elevate the animal, the meat, to the level of human, not human meat, not the human animal. So if a person eats, and the only thing that happens is that he becomes healthier, that's not elevation. Unless, as a healthier human being, you then do a mitzvah. In other words, you go up. If you go up with that additional health that you received from the food, now the food is going up as you go up. So that's why the food has to be absorbed into the human within the human, not into the animal or vegetable or mineral within the human. Make sense? So, in order for this process to happen, there are two conditions: split hooves and chewing the cud. What is that called, chewing the cud? Ruminator. The animal has to be a ruminator. That you can elevate, eating means elevating, you can elevate food if it has split hooves and chews its cud. Let's understand what these two things are. If you eat only a vegetable, you have to elevate that vegetable to the human within you, not to the animal within you. Anything you eat, but when you eat meat, you're eating all three at the same time. It saves you a little... So, for this purpose, you don't have to eat your vegetables with your meat, because there are vegetables in the meat. You're getting all of it in one spoonful. Anyway, here's the thing. A human being elevates himself to the level of godliness. What does that mean? One aspect of it is that a human being, every human being, has a certain personality, which means a certain leaning. Some people lean towards kindness. Some people lean towards strictness, judgment. Some people lean towards compassion. Some people lean towards stubbornness. Different personalities. Each of these characteristics is useful. But because of our nature, we are limited to the personality or the characteristic with which we are created and born. So a person who is by nature kind is pretty much limited to kindness. Not that he can't do other stuff, but when he tries to be strict, it's not the same. He's good at being kind. When he's strict, it's okay, but he's not good at it. Or in different words, when he is being kind, he does it with great enthusiasm because it feels familiar, it feels like him. So he's enthusiastic about it. When he has to do the opposite, when a kind person has to be strict, he can't possibly do it with the same enthusiasm as he does kindness. So the people who are really good at tough love, they're basically tough people. It's not that they're as kind as anybody else, but they know what they have to do. No, they enjoy it too much. So these people who run these organizations or these programs, and they're really tough with the kids. They're enjoying this too much. They're basically following their personality. That's their enthusiasm, because they're good at being strict, probably with themselves as well as with others. Person who is by nature strict can also be kind, but not to the same extent, not with the same enthusiasm, not with the same pleasure. Because when you do what your personality dictates, you're doing it effortlessly and with pleasure. When you're doing that which your personality doesn't dictate, you're doing it as a duty, which is very noble, but it's not as enjoyable. There's a big difference between a duty and a pleasure. That's a sign that the person has remained human and has not elevated himself to the level of godliness. Because if you elevate yourself to a level of godliness, you become equally capable and equally enthusiastic about the task at hand, whether it is within your personality or it's the opposite of your personality. Whether it goes with the grain or against the grain will not make any difference, because now you're functioning on a godly level, and for God, kindness, severity, compassion, they're all equal. Because they don't draw attention to themselves, in godliness, the kindness is only there to serve holiness, and the severity is there to serve holiness. So one doesn't take precedence over the other. One is not more attractive than the other. They're both there for a higher purpose. So when your kindness is your personality, then it's not elevated. And then it will draw you more than the other characteristics, than the other traits. So you will be limited. But when you elevate yourself to the level of godliness, it doesn't make a difference. Whatever needs to happen, that's what your enthusiasm is. So, for example, when the people left Egypt, God took them out into a desert. What was the purpose of that? Eventually, the people got hungry, they started complaining, they got food from heaven, but it wasn't good enough, it was ruining their digestion, it didn't have any fiber. So they complained that they needed meat, so they got meat, and that wasn't good, and then they were thirsty, and water had to come from a rock, and then they got confused as to which rock, and whether you're supposed to speak to it or hit it. It was such a mess. Why didn't they take the other route where you can stop and buy some food? Why did they have to go into a desert? The answer is God was testing. God says, I tested you by taking you into a desert. What was the test? To see if they could go without food? To see how long they could go without water? A desert means you don't have what you need. God said, if you're going to follow me, having or not having what you need shouldn't make any difference. You're here to serve. Don't get distracted. If you have, fine. If you don't have, it's also fine. In other words, whether you're rich or poor is not going to change your relationship with God. You can serve God out of wealth. You can serve God out of poverty. If you serve God out of poverty, you will likely serve God in wealth. If you don't serve God out of poverty, you probably won't serve Him when you're wealthy either. Because either you transcend these issues, or you're limited and stuck in the human condition where you can have only one quality or one characteristic at a time. Just by the way, it is possible for a person who is kind to change his personality. I'm not sure it's a worthy task, because, what's the difference? Either way, you have to serve God, so whether you serve God with kindness or you serve God with severity, what's the difference? It's not worth the effort that it takes to change your personality. But when you do change your personality, and a kind person now becomes a strict person, now it will be difficult for him to be kind, to the same degree that he is strict. So it's not that you can't change your personality, but you cannot have two personalities with equal enthusiasm at the same time. Also, this explains, God said to Avraham, if you pass the 10th test, then the other 9 will take on a whole new significance. Will become much more meaningful. The first 9 were tests of kindness, but Avraham was by personality kind. The 10th test was an act of real cruelty. So God said to him, if you pass this test, then I will know that all the other times when you were kind, you weren't following your personality. You were obeying me. How will I know that? Because if you can be as enthusiastic about this as you were about the other 9, then obviously you have transcended your personality. And that's why at the last minute, God says to Avraham, don't do it. That's good enough. Because now I know that you are God-fearing. What does it mean? 75 years Avraham sacrificed his life for God before God even spoke to him. God didn't speak to Avraham until he was 75. At 75 years of age, God said to Avraham, Lech lecha, leave your father's home and come with me. That's the first time God spoke to him. That was the first of the 10 tests. Now, Avraham is 137 years old. So since the time he was 75, he has been serving God diligently. And God says, now that you're doing this, now I know you're God-fearing. Now, what was he until now? So again, the answer is, God-fearing means that when you do kindness, it's because of God, not because of your personality. You're God-fearing. You follow what God says, not what your personality said. So that even when he was doing kindness, it was out of fear of God, not because he liked it. And that's why he was able to wake up early in the morning and go to do the Akedah, to sacrifice his son, with the same enthusiasm that he would have done an act of kindness. Because when you're elevated to the level of godliness, all mitzvahs are equal. Because it's about God, not about you. That's why before you eat meat, you have to see whether you have split hooves. A split hoof means you can have two commitments, two devotions at the same time, and they're equal. A split hoof, by the way, doesn't mean a hoof with a crack in it. A split hoof, if you look at an animal that has split hooves, a split hoof is actually like two fingers. I'm not sure if they can actually move separately. A horse does not have a split hoof. It may have a crack in the hoof, but the crack doesn't go all the way through. It's not two separate fingers. So this ability to go both ways, kindness and severity, which is represented by a split, because when you have a split, you have right and left, kindness and severity. That split has to be through and through. Not just on the surface you can do kindness or severity. It has to be a true split. You not only can do kindness, you can be kind when that's necessary, and you can be strict when that's necessary, and both with the same enthusiasm. If you can do that, then you are ready to eat, meaning to elevate. But that merely represents the fact that you're no longer stuck in the human condition, which is, of course, a necessary part of elevating yourself. You have to not be stuck in the human condition. But then you have to keep moving and growing in the levels of godliness. So it's not enough, certainly, to deny your human personality. And that's why you have to have a second indicator. Before you know for sure that you can elevate what you're about to eat, in other words, it can be eaten, not just chewed and swallowed, you have to have a second indicator. And that is rumination. It's interesting that in English also, a ruminator means a person who thinks a lot. He was ruminating, right? The sign of chewing the cud means re-examining, reprocessing, which is what the animal actually does. By chewing its cud, it gets more nutrition out of the food. Because every time it re-chews it, it releases more whatever goodies that the grass or whatever it is it's eating. So it's reprocessing, and each time that it reprocesses, it gains more from that food. Because if you process only once, you're not getting everything you can out of it. And this is why we're told that if you don't chew your food, you're getting very little out of it. The more you chew your food, the more you're going to get out of it. So in other words, the more you examine, the more you process what you're doing, the more you get out of it. And that basically means acting, behaving in a thoughtful manner. The more thoughtful you are of your behavior, the higher and the finer and the purer and the cleaner the behavior will be. Because you're processing it over and over again, and each time you get rid of some of the useless stuff and release more of the useful stuff. That's called processing. That's called digesting. Digesting is a selection process. Your digestive system locates the useful nutrients and saves them, and identifies the useless klipa and gets rid of them. When a person is trying to elevate the world towards godliness, it's not enough to be able to separate himself from his own appetites. That's the first step. That's split hooves. But the second quality has to be that the person has to be on constant vigilance, constantly re-examining, so that if it's good, he needs it to be better. And if it's better, he needs it to be more better. And that keeps the process going. So that it's not that you elevate yourself for a moment and then you drop again. Then you elevate yourself and you drop again. No, elevation is a constant. The ladder that stands on earth keeps going into heaven. It never stops. So elevation is a constant process, not a momentary inspiration. So if it's a momentary inspiration, you are elevated from your appetites, you are inspired and you forget that you're hungry, or you forget that you have a certain personality, and you go and do what needs to be done because it needs to be done, that's split hooves. But then what happens when the inspiration is over? Like after Yontif. What about after the honeymoon? Sure, in the honeymoon you're at your best behavior. You're inspired. Of course you're attentive. Of course you're sensitive. Of course you're thoughtful. You're inspired. It's a honeymoon. But what happens when the inspiration goes? Then it's downhill from there. For this you have to have chewing the cud. When a person sees that he is doing these two things, he sees a split hoof and he sees a cud chewing, then he knows that if he eats this meat, he will elevate it. It won't drag him down. But this is an interesting thing. When it says in Torah, don't eat this, you can look at it as an instruction. The do or the don't do. So when the Torah says don't eat this, it means refrain from eating. Or you can understand it on a little deeper level. When Torah says don't eat this, means it will not get eaten. So the commandment is not just an instruction, it's a description. When you eat this animal, it will not get eaten. So this is a non-eating animal, a non-eaten animal. Well, the preparation is part of the process of elevation. But that you can elevate, yes, you can elevate this. Now, there are 4 animals that have one of the 2 signs and not the other. The animal that represents more than any other the unkosher world is, of course, the pig. Yet the pig, in some sense, is not the most unkosher because it does have one of the 2 signs. So you could think, well, this is half kosher. Whatever half kosher means. Because it does have split hooves, but it doesn't chew its cud. The others chew their cud but don't have split hooves. Well, one of the things they say about the pig is that not only isn't it kosher, it's also arrogant. Because most animals, barnyard animals, when they lie down, they fold their feet under them. A horse lies down, he folds his hoofs under him. He doesn't want you to see that he doesn't have split hooves. He's embarrassed by it. But the pig lies down and stretches his feet out in front of him as if to say, look, I have split hooves. So not only isn't it kosher, it tries to pass itself off as kosher. There's an incredible lesson in that. There are people who have certain spiritual qualities. They have split hooves. They have huge personalities. They have a wide range of emotions and intelligence, and they can be anything. They can be everything. They're good at everything. That's one of the signs of kosher. That you can be kind today and strict tomorrow with the same enthusiasm, with the same talent, with the same brilliance. And there are people who are that way. And you would think, okay, this is a kosher thing. It's not. It's just multi-talented. But it's charismatic. But it's all their personality. It has nothing to do with God. They just happen to have a huge personality. And those are the ones who will pass themselves off as holy. But they're not really. Because they don't chew their cud. They're not growing. They are more than content with their hooves, with their split hooves. And they are not growing, and they are not considerate of how they behave. They just happen to be gifted, and it makes them arrogant. But there's nothing godly about it. I was talking to this Jewish boy who was studying with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, Transcendental Meditation. And he was trying to impress me with the power that the Maharishi has in that he is teaching his disciples to levitate. Did you ever see anybody levitate? No? You don't know what you're missing. Levitation is really a remarkable ability. The person is sitting in a yoga position with his legs folded in front of him, and he lifts off the ground. They do it themselves, yeah, by sheer force of will. Of course, they don't go very far. They rise for about, 7 inches, 8 inches, and then they fall back down. And then they rise again. That's what you were hearing. Now, as remarkable as that ability is, I fail to see the point. It's an acrobatic feat. But so what? So this guy is telling me that he is going to learn, by staying in this school, he is going to learn to levitate. I said, yeah, so? He says, I'm telling you, it's for real. I said, so? He says, you don't believe me? I said, no, I believe you, but so what? I do believe you. So what? There are people who have incredible psychic talents, incredible spiritual powers, and you're in awe. Because you go to the Olympics, that's pretty awesome too. The guy can jump higher than you can see. But then again, so what? Why would a human being devote his life to jumping? It's a gold medal. Gets to be on the box of Wheaties. So there are people who have these incredible talents, and they look like they have split hooves, and they're very quick to show them off. But it is not a sign of kosher. Not a sign of kosher. There's nothing godly about it. In a certain way, the Nazis had this talent. Germans in general have that talent. They're very capable at doing what needs to be done. They're not too particular. They're very not particular. They're not at all particular. Whatever it is that needs to be done, they are very good at getting it done. So if it's a matter of being kind, they're great at it. Music, philosophy, science, technology, whatever you want, they're great at it. Mass murder, they're great at it. With exactly the same enthusiasm, with exactly the same ability, with exactly the same precision. They are very flexible. Because to them, what's most important is you got your orders, you do what you're told. That's split hooves. And you might think that that's godly, because Hitler did think that that was godly. He thought that was the ultimate superior human being. But they don't chew their cud. And so when you ask them on the trial at Nuremberg, why did you do what you do? He has no idea. There's no chewing of the cud. Interesting that the most critical thing, the most degrading thing that a German could accuse another person of being is a swine. Schwein. Now, if you're Jewish, I understand if you want to insult somebody, you call them a pig. If you're not Jewish, why is that such a big insult? An American farmer would never say, you're a pig. Hey, what do you got against pigs? They got nothing against pigs. So what kind of insult is this to say you're a pig? So do the cows. The cows don't enjoy it as much. They're not kosher and smart. That makes them dangerous. Creation continues constantly, but all it does is create. It doesn't teach. God makes sure that everything exists. And then what? It can't grow in its existence. It can't increase in its existence. Service. Will the created being serve God or not serve God? If the free will of the human being will do the right thing, then there will be service. And everything will be elevated. It won't exist more. It will serve a purpose. So existence is what goes on constantly. But growth, sometimes we grow, sometimes we don't. But growth doesn't mean more existence. It's a completely different project. What function does it serve? So it's not another project in existence. So it's not like God gives us existence and then we have to add existence. No, we don't add existence. We add purpose. If he doesn't serve, it means he doesn't live. He only exists. So that is the significance and the meaning and the content and the depth of the kosher story. There are those who have split hooves but don't chew their cud. And then there are those who chew their cud but they don't have split hooves. Chewing your cud but not having split hoof means you're constantly thinking, you're constantly ruminating, you're constantly planning to become good. But that's about it. It never happens. You're stuck. So that's all the good intentions with which the road is paved. So the camel, for example, always looks thoughtful. You always wonder, what is he thinking? So the camel is chewing its cud and it's chewing its cud. By the end of the day, it's still just a camel. So what has he been thinking all day? There was a teacher in yeshiva. It was a very, very insightful person. He understood human nature. And there was a student who spent a lot of time meditating. But it never led anywhere. It was not, he really didn't know what he was doing. But it seemed so serious and so important, so officious. So one day when they were talking, he said to him, it was actually a group of people, and he said, in a market once, in the shtetl where I came from, there's some guy, people were selling fish, chicken. One guy opened up a booth, and he was selling he was selling a bird for an exorbitant amount of money. The chicken cost $10, and this bird cost $100, and it was half the size of the chicken. So the peasants came over to him and said, what is this? $100 for this bird? It'll barely make 2 meals. So the guy said, don't be so ignorant. This is not for eating. This bird can talk. That's why it's worth $100. The next day, another guy opens up a booth next to him, and he's selling turkey. You know turkeys? For $300 a turkey. So the people came to him and said, what, are you crazy? How much meat can you get out of a turkey? He says, don't be so ignorant. This bird can think. Which is even better than a bird that can talk. Because the turkey always walks around looking like he's busy. He's got something on his mind. He's thinking. So the chewing of the cud is a person who displays his thoughtful nature, but the thoughts don't go anywhere. All he does is think, and it leads nowhere. Either kind or he's strict, and he can't go. It's like people say, you ask people, why do you dress like that? Why do you have to wear such a immodest outfit? He said, I don't have to. To me, it just doesn't matter. See, you're hung up. You have to dress this way. To me, it's nothing. I mean, I can dress any way. I can go either way. I'm being thoughtful about this. But then the question is, if you're really so thoughtful about it and you can go either way, how come it's always this way? So you're putting on a show of being thoughtful, but you're not. You keep doing the same thing. That's the Ruminator without the split hooves. There's the joke among Chassidim, that, a Chassid is not supposed to be hung up on food. So there's this one guy who put on a show of being above it. And he would come to a wedding or to a party, they would ask him by the dessert, they would say, do you want the chocolate or the vanilla? And he would say, what do you want? Chocolate, vanilla? I mean, what? Come on, the chocolate, vanilla. All right, chocolate. And it was always chocolate. So first he puts on this whole show about how indifferent he is to the whole thing, but it's always a chocolate. That's a camel. That's chewing your cud, but not splitting your hoof. So if you want to be a kosher animal, eat the vanilla. The reason God created the world in such a way that there are similarities between lower forms of life and higher forms of life is because in order for the human being to elevate the lower forms of life, he has to have something in common with them, otherwise they're worlds apart and they can't affect each other. So in order for a human being to elevate a vegetable, he's got to have a vegetable within him as well. So there has to be some similarity there, otherwise there'll be no interaction. But ancestry? No, ancestry. That's not factual, that's not science, that's a leap of imagination. It's not even an educated guess. It's just science fiction. For that very same reason, eating is a very corrupting activity. Because if you're going to be capable of elevating the food, and that comes by virtue of the fact that you have something in common with the food. There's an animal in you, there's a vegetable in you, there's a mineral in you. And that's why you have enough similarity to elevate what you're eating, then it has to follow that having that kind of similarity would also permit the food to affect you. If it's enough similarity for you to affect it, then it's also enough for it to affect you. So eating is never a neutral activity. You're either elevating it or it's corrupting you. There's no in-between. There's no eating without impact. So either you're impacting the food or the food is impacting you. Or both at the same time. And that's why, for example, when you eat on Shabbos, it's a mitzvah, you're elevating the food to the level of Shabbos and so on. But then after Shabbos, you need to clean up a little bit. You've eaten too much. It has had a bit of a corrupting effect. Well, maybe not on Shabbos, but on Yom Tov. That's one of the differences between Shabbos and Yom Tov, is that Shabbos is holier than Yom Tov, and that's why the food you eat on Shabbos does not drag you down, unless you literally eat like an animal. But the food on Yom Tov, because Yom Tov is not as holy, even as you elevate the food that you eat on Yom Tov, it kind of leaves a negative effect. And that's why even physically, eating involves a number of processes. One process is you absorb the food into your system. The other process is you get rid of the rest. So when you wash your hands before a meal, you're elevating the food. But then you have to wash your hands at the end of the meal to wash away the bad stuff that it shouldn't affect you. That's called the after water. Because women don't do it. Only men do it.